First of all, Jamie, thank you for your time. I know you're very busy, and we're going to talk about your research in central Jordan, close to the Jordan River, and your research was related to olive oil production in the Bronze Age. Can you tell us more about the sites where you excavated and where you dealt with different olive oil presses?
Sure, and thanks for talking to me. So I've been digging at a site called Kharbat Ghazlan, which means, of course, in Arabic, the ruins of the mother of the Gazelles. And it's a teeny tiny site located in the eastern uplands of the Rift Escarpment of the Jordan Valley. So quite close to Deir Abu Said, sort of halfway between Hidaj Lun and then come about halfway down the escarpment. And it's in a place called the Wadi Rayyan. And of course, if anyone knows the Wadi Rayyan, you'll know that in the springtime, it's just covered in wildflowers and is, I think, the most beautiful place in the planet. This site, Kharbat Ghazlan, is located about 400 meters above sea level, halfway up the Wadi. And it's on a tiny hilltop that sticks out above the Wadi. And that means if you stand on it, you've got about 300-degree, almost 360-degree view all the way around because you're in such a prominent location. So if you look west, you're looking all the way down to the Jordan Valley and across to the hills of Palestine beyond. And if you look east, you look all the way up the Wadi, right up to the Transjordan Plateau and the hills of Ajloon. So it's a remarkably beautiful location, but there's two facts about this site that don't fit each other, and that's driving this research. The first fact is the size of the site, and it's really small. It's about 0.4 hectares. That means it's only about 100 meters long and about 50 meters wide. And an archaeological project encountering a site of that size would normally call it a village or a farmstead or a hamlet or something like that. So it's small. And because it's small, we assume it's not very significant. But the other fact, and this doesn't jar with this, is that to get onto the site, you have to go across a sort of a low saddle joining this hilltop to the ridge behind. It's the only way you can access the hill. And around that, like a barrier, is a monumental, massive defensive wall or enclosure wall. And across this key junction, it's built of huge blocks of megalithic sized stones in 2 rows that would have taken an enormous amount of manpower to have constructed. And that's quite clearly to regulate access to the site. And then that continues as a sort of a smaller enclosure wall all the way around the site. And if you open a textbook, and so the site dates to about 2000, 2500 BC, at the end of the early Bronze Age. If you open a textbook about this period, it tells you that no one was living in enclosed sites anymore. And yet we've got this site with an enclosure around it, which is so small. So the driving question is, why defend such a small site? And I think the answer is something to do with olive oil.
What we know about the olive oil production in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age, because there are different theories. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think in order to interpret this site and why it's significant, we have to put it into this larger context of olive oil production. So we know that one of the first places on the entire planet to produce olive oil is the Jordan Valley region. And I mean, the Greater Levant, all the way up to sort of the Syro-Turkish border, but particularly the Jordan Valley area and the hills on either side are the first areas that people are extracting olive oil. This happens in the Stone Age, the Neolithic period, say 6000 BC, give or take. 1,000 years later, they've done it in such a way that trees are domesticated. That means that the morphology, the shape of olive trees, the way they bear fruit has been changed by human activity. And that means that their fruit is much larger. The ratio of flesh to stone is much larger, so that the fruit is yielding larger flesh and much more olive oil. And so we cannot in Jordan understand the rise of complex societies, the rise of farming societies and civilizations without understanding the production of olive oil, because they're doing both things at the same time. And it's a really important point, because the shape, the flavor, the character of ancient societies in Jordan has olive oil running through its veins right from the very beginning, which is really interesting. And it's particularly interesting for the emergence of the first cities in Jordan and sort of the greater southern Levant. So the first cities emerge around about 3100 BC, give or take. And when I say a city, what I mean is a site in the landscape that's very central, that's got a massive fortification wall around it, it's very large, and that had a large population in it, and that had a sort of a ruling power structure, whether it was from a king, whether it was from a temple, or a sort of a combination of both. And so it's an escalation of scale in terms of how people were arranging themselves. And that story of the first cities that sort of blossomed around 3000 BC in the southern Levant, particularly in Jordan, places such as Pella, for example, or Tel El Hammam down near the Dead Sea. Part of the reason these cities blossomed when they did was because already people in this area were producing olive oil, the first people in the world. And there was a civilization to the south, ancient Egypt, which couldn't produce much olive oil, because olive trees have to grow in well-drained areas in certain climatic zones, and the escarpment hills of the Jordan Rift Valley are perfect. The Nile Delta of Egypt, which floods, that's no good for olive wood because the tree roots rot in the annual flood. It's sandy, it's dry, it's the wrong environment. But the rising old kingdom of ancient Egypt, they start sending out trade emissaries to the southern Levant. And these merchants come back and go, they've got this extraordinary stuff up in Jordan, olive oil. And in fact, the Egyptians call it sedget oil, and it becomes one of their 7 sacred oils. And one of its jobs was for the preparation of mummification, particularly embalming. And so a remarkable trade arises in the 4th millennium BC, with olive oil being shipped from the southern Levant into Egypt, and probably cattle being shipped from Egypt back into the Levant. The Middle East was always an oil economy. It just starts as being an olive oil one. And on the back of this trade, I mean, there are a whole lot of other reasons as well, but this is one of the most important. On the back of this oil trade, these early cities flourish and develop and emerge in the southern Levant. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon. But something happens to this system because it collapses gradually around about 2000, somewhere between 2600, 2400 BC, sort of a staggered collapse. It kind of shudders for a few centuries and then just disappears. And probably, I mean, there are several reasons for this. One of them is a shift in climate. One of them might be the Egyptian army doing incursions, and all of these have their merits and their detractors. But I think one of the main reasons for this, and I'm not the only one to think this, is that there was a cessation in the oil trade. Imagine Dubai today if the oil trade suddenly stopped. And that's what I think you've got to imagine what the southern Levant was back then, because ancient Egypt suddenly had a development in their maritime shipping technology. And instead of trading oil with the southern Levant, they started sending ships all the way up to the coast to sort of central northern Lebanon, southern Syria, trading olive oil from these regions, hooking over to Cyprus, picking up copper and coming back down. And this triangle bypassed the southern Levant completely. And I think one of the effects of that was this early urban system collapsed. When this early urban system collapsed, its populations abandoned all these city centers and dispersed into the countryside. And it's that period, this so-called period of darkness that has been referred to in the past. That's the period in which Khirbet Ghazlan was settled. And so what I think Khirbet Ghazlan has something to do is the reconstruction or the reanimation of an olive oil industry from one that was an international trade to something that was much more local.
Do we have evidence about the seasonal work of residents of Ghassan, or what's your opinion about the extraction of olive oil with those primitive factories, so to say? Because they operated like some kind of manufacturers, Bronze Age manufacturers.
Yeah, it's a great question. So in order to understand that, we've of course got to understand how olive oil is extracted, and there are many ways to extract olive oil, but the more traditional ways involve certain steps. And olive fruit, have you ever picked an olive straight off the tree and you try to bite it, and it's really bitter and horrible?
It's unedible.
Yeah, exactly. And that's because it contains a compound called oleuropein, and it's not digestible. And so the process of olive oil extraction is about removing that compound and then just distilling it down to the oil. So after all the fruit is picked and harvested, that happens every year around the middle of October through to November, the olive harvest season, the autumn or the fall. At that point, everyone with olive trees picks all their fruit. The fruit is taken to a central press, and then, well, traditionally what happens is, first of all, the fruit has to be crushed into kind of like a paste, and that's both the fruit and the stone. And then that paste gets smeared onto sort of fibrous mats, almost like, imagine smearing peanut butter onto a large pancake, and it's kind of like that, smearing this paste onto these fibrous mats. Then these mats get stacked up, and then they get pressed. Traditionally by putting weights on them and then sort of forcing them down, often through kind of counterlevers. Nowadays through mechanized vice systems, that by applying pressure to all that stacked up mats with all the paste, that exudes the olive oil. And so when you see it coming out, you see it all dripping down the side, like these beautiful golden tears. And then of course funnels in, and then you can collect this pure virgin olive oil, which is, you know, the best tasting thing in the world. So that's the kind of evidence that the process we're trying to understand at Khirbet Ghazlan. And you're absolutely right to ask about seasonality, because I don't think people are living at this site all the time. I think this is a village where people are living, doing normal sheep and goat, probably actually down in the Jordan Valley. But come the middle of October, and what they do is the community, or part of the community probably, comes up to the uplands of the escarpment, which is the perfect sort of Goldilocks zone for where olive trees grow. And they might be there for maybe only a month. And for that month, they're picking their fruit, they're crushing their fruit, they're collecting the oil, pressing the fruit and collecting the oil. So we've got to look for lots of different archaeological evidence for this process in order to interpret what's going on. What are these signatures that you would expect to find left in the ground from this ancient process? And of course, the first thing to look for are the olive presses. And right next to the site, cut into the very microcrystalline limestone, are half a dozen fruit presses, quite clearly. Now, each of them they're shaped rectangular, like a rectangular bathtub, I guess, cut into the bedrock, maybe sort of 1 meter long and half a meter wide. And their bottom away slopes just gradually, and at the base of the slope, cut into the bedrock, there's usually a circular hole, and then through that there's a larger sort of collection tank cut into the bedrock. So you can imagine people stacking all their mats full of the crushed fruit up in the top basin, stepping on it, lever pressing it with stones or whatever to exude all the juice, which flows down through the hole and then collects into probably a jar or something placed into that collection tank at the bottom. It's difficult to date these because they're just surface rock cut features. They might have been made in the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age, or the early Bronze Age 1 period instead of this end of the early Bronze Age. But they seem to have been used in this end of the early Bronze Age period, and all of them have got a very close spatial and visual relationship with Khirbet Ghazlan. So I think the fact they're there is really important. Then, once the fruit has been pressed, that oil that gets collected, particularly in this kind of early period, without mechanized, traditionally gets in storerooms for a couple of weeks. And what happens then is all of that juice and water and oil separates. The oil is lighter, so it floats to the top, and the water, of course, goes down to the bottom. And so what we would expect to find are a lot of, say, storage jars. We would expect to find a lot of ceramic materials for decanting away. Sorry?
Yeah, containers. We expect to find containers for olive oil, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the storage rooms that they would go in. And that's exactly what the archaeology is producing. We're not finding large kind of standard houses full of cooking pots and drinking bowls, drinking cups, and the kind of standard domestic package you would expect to find. None of that's there. What we have got are a couple of storage compounds, each with very small rooms, maybe a meter by a meter. That means they're dark and they're cool, perfect for storing oil vessels in. And the ceramic, so all the ancient pottery that we're finding are almost all storage jars. And of these, 24 are complete. They're broken, but they're complete. And a conservator at the American Center for Research in Amman has been putting these back together. And that's extraordinary because any other village site of this period that you dig, what you would expect to find, sure, you'd expect to find storage jars because people store stuff. But you'd expect to find everything else they're living with, their cooking pots, their drinking cups, and they're not there. It's almost all storage. And that gives it a remarkable flavor in terms of what's going on at the site. So we've got the crushing vats, the presses, we've got the storage vessels, we've got the houses they're in. And some of these vessels, by the way, they're quite large storage jars, but right up the top, they've got cylindrical spouts sticking up the top. That doesn't kind of make sense. You can't pick these things up and pour them like that. If they were full of liquid, it would be too heavy. But I think they're decanting vats. So imagine a big jar like this. You've had your sort of oil and juice settling over a few weeks. The oil comes up the top. All you need to do then is pour some water in and all the oil decants off the top. So it's perfectly fit for form for an olive oil factory. So there's a whole lot of these sort of archaeological signatures that speak to this ancient process.
We know that there are around 1,200 types of olives, and according to our present knowledge, olives moved from Eastern Mediterranean, from the region of southern Levant, towards Western Mediterranean, namely Spain, Italy, Portugal. How long the process took? I remember once you were talking about that at 2 years ago.
It's a complicated issue, and it's an issue that the archaeology can tell you a lot about. When are the first times, by mapping the first time you find olive seeds record, you can see the spread of olive oil domestication or olive domestication oil production. And that gives you half the story. You're kind of looking at it with one hand over your eye, because with the development of DNA technology, looking at olive DNA tells us a huge amount of information as well. And there's been a couple of projects, and I wish I'd thought of this project because it's just like the dream project. A scholar decided to go and do DNA samples of as many olive trees in as many Mediterranean countries as he could. And that meant he spent all his research trip just traveling the entire Mediterranean and wandering through the olive groves. I mean, a nice research project if you have to think about it. But what he discovered and what a lot of other DNA research has discovered and what the archaeology tells us is that there's kind of three areas of olive domestication. So the Mediterranean once was covered with different species of olive, and as you say, 1,200 species at least. Then in the last ice age, that was a really terrible condition for olive trees. And a lot of the areas they were in kind of died out. And there were three kind of holdout areas of olives, one in Spain, one in sort of southern Italy and Greece, and one in the southern Levant, particularly the Jordan Valley. And in these three areas, then there were three sort of genetic signatures of different sorts of olive trees. And the ones that start to get domesticated first are the ones in the southern Levant, about 6000 BC. The ones in Greece and Italy, and particularly Sicily, that's a different type of olive, a different species, according to the DNA. And that doesn't really get domesticated until about 4000 BC. But it's an indigenous domestication. It's got nothing to do with the ones from Jordan coming west. It's local olives being domesticated themselves just a little bit after. The ones in Spain are fascinating. So the ones in Spain, different DNA again, they get domesticated a bit after the ones in Italy, and it is a completely different species. But if you go to Spain now and pour olive oil on your salad, what you are tasting is olive oil that originally would have come from the trees in the southern Levant. And the reason for that is about 1000 BC, most of the domestic olive species in southern Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, were replaced. And that's probably because Phoenician sailors sailing in from, say, the coast of Lebanon, as these Phoenician merchants pulse through the Mediterranean, they set up hundreds of colonies on the southern coast of Spain, and they bring with them baby olive trees and plant their own olive trees, taking a species that is indigenous to, say, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, southern Syria, and transplanting it literally into southern Spain. And so that then takes over from the local indigenous Spanish olive. It's still there, but not nearly in as great a number as the ones from the southern Levant.
What was the importance of olive oil and oils in the diet of Mediterranean people back in the Bronze Age? Because we can see that the whole areas owe their development to production of olive oils and growing of oils.
Yeah, oil was critical into what we think of as the diet. So think of today, say, the Mediterranean diet. And the Mediterranean diet was listed by UNESCO a few years ago as a sort of intangible heritage. The Mediterranean diet is predicated on the sort of this holy trinity of grape, grain, and wheat, so wine, oil, and bread. So you cannot imagine the modern Mediterranean diet without the role of olive oil. It's one of the holy trinity. And my point about the trade of olive oil shaping the way civilization looks, well, the use of olive oil shapes the way diet and culinary trends develop. So from the Stone Age, when people are harvesting wild olive oil, that's suddenly olive oil is a hugely new commodity. And by the time they get into the Copper Age, they've worked out that they can do a whole lot with it, not just eat it. One of the main things they're actually doing with olive oil is not eating it or cooking with it, but is lighting it, using it for fuel. And so suddenly you get, in the early Bronze Age, the development of oil lamps for the first time. And that's because people have worked out that they can burn olive oil to get a flame. So you get small olive oil lamps with a wick coming out, which they light, and you can suddenly have transportable light in your house at nighttime for the first time in history. That's quite remarkable. Instead of when the sun goes down, either you're stapled to a fireplace or else you're fumbling around in the dark, suddenly you are able to take an oil lamp and move around the landscape with light. And that's a remarkable phenomenon. So it's got all these issues as well, or the uses. But by the time the early Bronze Age kicks in, we're seeing a change in ceramic repertoires for cooking and for eating. So think of the meze dishes, for example, which are so well known. I love sitting down for a big meal in Amman or somewhere, and all the meze dishes come out, and all the large platter dishes come out with the food. These sorts of dishes start appearing, and I mean physically dishes, these sort of ceramic vessels start appearing at the beginning of the early Bronze Age. So, around 4000, 3500 BC. And that's because olive oil is now being used as a commodity for cooking. And that changes the way that people are cooking, and it changes the sorts of food that they can make. And that's when we're starting to see much more sort of communal feasting, where oil makes you're able to cook a lot larger quantities and all this sort of stuff, transfer heat better in the cooking process. So, it is kind of the wonder product of its day. I mean, imagine trying to cook without olive oil today, and then, it's exactly the same back in the early Bronze Age.
Regarding Hirbet Husran, where you operated recently, is there any other sites in Wadi Rayyan that has olive oil presses and olive oil hammocks?
Yeah, so I first visited the Wadi Rayyan when I was a student in my early 20s, and I was going with an Australian project run by another Jamie, in this case a girl Jamie Lovell, who was working at the Council for British Research in the Levant and at the University of Sydney. And she was looking at the Copper Age, so the Chalcolithic period. And this was the first period really that people had drawn up from the Jordan Valley floor into these highlands of the Rift Valley escarpment, the hills of the Wadis, in order to produce olive oil for the first time. And so there's a site called El Khawarij, which is this Chalcolithic Copper Age period. This is probably one of the first sites that people are manufacturing olive oil all the way up in the hills. And what's fascinating about Jamie Lovell's discoveries there, in addition to all the evidence for olive production from this much earlier prehistoric period, is that one of the artifacts she found was a beautiful mace head, so a diorite stone, perfectly round mace head, perforated in the middle. It's a kind of a ceremonial kind of axe, but it's Egyptian. And why on earth is something manufactured in Egypt all the way down to the Nile Delta? How did it get all the way up to the hills in the back of nowhere up the Wadi Rayyan? And I think what she was picking up there and what she was finding at El Khawarij was the very first whispers of this trade in oil between the southern Levant and Egypt that would rise up to a loud shout and a song through the main Bronze Age period, and then ended in a very brief moment of silence at the very end of the early Bronze Age, which is when Khirbet Ghazlan is founded. So there's a long-term time story to look at the relationship between olive, these highland areas, international trade, local trade, and the sort of development and cessation of urban societies in Jordan.
Can we say a few words about international olive oil trade between southern Levant, Egypt, and other centers? But I think Egypt was the main importer of olive oil back then.
Egypt certainly was, and many years ago, like over 100 years ago, a very famous early archaeologist called Flinders Petrie was digging tombs at a place called Abydos at Egypt in the Delta, and he discovered this certain type of jar, sort of a red kind of burnish and decoration on it. And he found it in huge quantities at this early Bronze Age period, sort of the early Bronze Age 1 period. So we're talking sort of, somewhere around 3000 BC, give or take. And he found these cached together in hundreds or dozens of tombs, very particular. And he called it Abydos ware because he happened to find it at this site of Abydos in Egypt. Much later on, with the introduction of scientific analyses to archaeology, scholars have said, well, this is very strange, this Abydos ware, these sorts of jars, because they seem very particular to certain areas in northern Egypt. We don't find them anywhere else. Why don't we analyze the clays and see where they're made? See what parts of Egypt they're made in. And what they discovered was that they're not made in Egypt at all. They're jars made in the southern Levant. So Israel, Palestine, Jordan. And they're being traded across. You open the newspaper today, go to the economic tables at the back, and you can see how much a barrel of oil will cost in US dollars. Well, these are Abydos jars. They're the oil barrels of the ancient world. They're just olive oil barrels being traded from the coast of the southern Levant into the Nile Delta. and a phenomenally important commodity because that's bringing all this oil into Egypt. And as I said before, olive oil is one of the what's called the 7 sacred oils at Egypt. And we have in the British Museum where I work a small stone alabaster palette, and it's got sort of like a graph of all these of the 7 different oils listed, and one of them called Sedget oil. The hieroglyph that's used to write that word is one of these jars, these abydos jars, these sort of ancient oil barrels that's used to designate olive oil. And although olive oil is really important for Egypt in terms of all the same uses that you can have up in lighting and cooking and all of that, because it's an imported commodity, it's regarded very highly. It's very precious. And it gets used a lot for elite preparation of the dead, for mummification, this sort of thing as well. So it really takes on quite an important, prestigious role.
Also in Wadi Rayyan, you've been working on the research of dolmens, and actually you published a book about megalithic stone tombs and the frequency of dolmens in the Jordan Valley. I remember you had the lecture 4 years ago.
Yeah.
The visible dead, dolmens and the landscape in Bronze Age Levant.
Yeah, so dolmen is actually in very ancient Breton, so ancient sort of Western French word, dolmen, meaning stone table. And so dolmens are massive megalithic tomb monuments, basically, with a vertical slab of rock, and then another slab placed on the top. And so they look like a massive ancient table. What they are is a tomb chamber. And they've usually got another slab at the end, at one of the short ends, and then the front end was left not open, but probably piled up with smaller rocks or with wood or something that you could access in and out. As Grandma Josephine dies, you put her remains in the family tomb. A year later, Grandpa Joe dies, his remains go in the same tomb as well. So you access in and out as these kind of charnel houses.
Yeah. It's like a family crypt.
Yeah, exactly. Family crypt, well put. And you get these in Jordan particularly. Jordan has thousands and thousands of these. And they very rarely do you find one or two in the landscape. You find them as cemeteries, as kind of 10 or 12, 20, some of the largest cemeteries, say around the edges of the Dead Sea, or certainly in ancient times up around Urbid Plateau, we're seeing them in their thousands. Where population centers are. They date, the problem with understanding dolmens is that because they're so visible, almost all of them have been robbed out, probably in antiquity and in modern times. And so where once they would have held the bones of, a dozen people and all the material that they're buried with, their jewelry or their ceramic vessels to take their olive oil to the afterlife, all that sort of stuff. All of that is gone and probably gone thousands of years ago. So it's hard to date them because they're usually empty. But a couple have been found that aren't empty. There's one found near a site called Tel El-Mari on the Madaba Plains a few years ago, and that contained exclusively material from the early Bronze I period. And we're talking about 3000 BC again. And that's the period when people are moving into these upland areas to grow olive trees to trade oil with Egypt. So it's all part of that same sort of story. But what's remarkable about the dolmens is that you only find them in areas where the bedrock is very, very hard, very microcrystalline. So people down in the Jordan Valley are probably still, as they are around places like Baba Dra or Jericho, where there's very soft soil deposits called marl. They're digging shafts down into the ground and then digging underground chambers. And that's what people are trying to do up in these hill areas. But the problem is they're no longer living on these soft deposits. They're living on really hard microcrystalline basalt or limestone. And so instead of digging down to make a chamber, people soon realize it's actually easier to kind of build a chamber above the ground. So large slabs are hewn out of the rock and a chamber is constructed. But what's super interesting about it is that how people are burying their dead. So you look at, say, for example, the tomb at the Dolmen at Tel El-Umairi, there's still about 20 people in there. Their bones are disarticulated, which means that they're probably being, once they've been defleshed, the bones are being collected and pushed back to the side of the tomb as more people are being put in. And certain material is being buried with them, certain types of pottery, certain types of jewelry, certain types of flint objects and all that sort of stuff. And if you compare that to underground tombs from the same period, but in the Jordan Valley, you're seeing much the same patterns. So funerary ritual is kind of standard, perhaps, in this area, but funerary architecture is different just depending on what geological zone you're in.
Regarding of differences, since you've worked on dolmens in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Cambodia, and Solomon Islands, can you draw the parallel between funerary customs and dolmens in different parts of the world? Can you compare dolmens in Wadi Rayyan, for instance, with dolmens in Cambodia?
Can we compare dolmens in Wadi Rayyan to dolmens in Cambodia? Yes, we can on a superficial level, but it's meaningless. The problem is that for a long time, people were. So when the first kind of Western travelers were traveling through the Middle East, and particularly the Levant, they happened upon these dolmen monuments, and they were very familiar with these monuments. There were some aspects of the archaeological landscape that they didn't understand, such as tell sites, the sort of superimposition of cities one on top of the other. That doesn't happen in Europe. These are particular to the Middle East. So to describe them, the Arabic word was used, the word tell. Dolmens were different because Western scholars went, oh, we know what they are. We find them around Denmark and Western France. Yeah. They're called dolmen. And so a European term was brought into the Middle East to explain what these were. And by bringing that European term into that context, they brought with them a whole lot of assumptions and baggage. And that has kind of held back our understanding of dolmens for over a century. And that essentially was, and this is what people at the time very strongly believed, was that there was a movement east to west of people, and that dolmens were one of those indexes that you could trace. So a very famous archaeologist called Gordon Childe, actually graduated at the University of Sydney like myself, but of course many, many years ago, he proposed a theory of diffusionism. And he said that something is developed or invented in one place, say, for example, metallurgy. And from that, migrating peoples take that idea and spread it out through the world. So farming starts in the Middle East and spreads out into Europe, he said. Same thing with dolmens, the megalithic tombs. He said that there were Mediterranean colonists, people starting in the Middle East and colonizing all the way through the Mediterranean into Europe, and he called them the apostles of the megalithic faith. And you could track them all the way through. And so for a long time, and some scholars still do today, even today, say that because these things look similar, they must be built by the same peoples. The problem is with that idea is that what we're dealing with is essentially a stone box. And it's not that hard an idea to come up with. And those arguments that because they look the same, they're built by the same people, they all started to come unstuck in the 1960s with the development of radiocarbon dating. Because radiocarbon dating showed that actually they're built at very different times wherever you go. Some are built in, say, the Indonesian islands today. There's probably one being built right now as we're speaking. And that's got nothing to do with the Bronze Age ones in Wadi Rayyan, or the ones in the Stone Age Neolithic in Europe. They're earlier than the ones in the Middle East. And so it doesn't quite gel. And so what we're looking at is sort of similar things being developed for different reasons by different peoples at different times. The problem is we're so conditioned as researchers to look for patterns that we see something and we make it more of a pattern than it possibly is.
Do we have the idea about the social status of people who were buried inside the dolmen? because some theories are that because of difficulty of building dolmens, members of Bronze Age aristocracy, so to say, were buried inside these chambers. Or maybe,
and
please.
that theory has been, so the theory of the Bronze Age chieftain, if you like, the Bronze Age aristocrat who can command, his family can command a lot of manpower. So the big man dies and his family say, right, the chief has died, everyone come in, we're going to build a dolmen. There's a couple of problems with that. The first of it is that in this period, to be honest, societies probably aren't that differentiated. They're much more, instead of hierarchical, they're what's called heterarchical, much more flat rather than vertical in the way that they're
more egalitarian.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at somewhere where we've got a lot of data, say, for example, one of the largest cemeteries ever excavated in the Middle East is this, from this period, this first start of the early Bronze Age period, about 3000 BC, down on the Hor, near the Dead Sea, at a place called Baba Dra. And a long-term expedition called the Expedition to the Dead Sea Plains, an American expedition, excavated hundreds of underground cemeteries from this period. And scholars, such as a scholar called Meredith Chesson from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, she's looked at all the material that's gathered from there, all the ceramics, all the jewelry, all the way all the bones have been presented, the way the different tombs have been constructed, and she's looking for differences or similarities. And her one of the lenses into this was to say, well, if some are bigger with better, more valuable equipment, and others are smaller, not as well built with less equipment, then we're getting evidence for social hierarchy. And Meredith says, well, it just isn't there. They're all pretty much the same, almost aggressively the same, that people are determined to have a kind of egalitarianism in death. That's what's happening underground. What's happening above the ground? So the theory that therefore, the chieftain would expect, a lone dolmen commanding the landscape, but that doesn't happen. They're all there in cemeteries, as I said. Some of these cemeteries, several hundred, up to 1,000, 1,500 dolmens in place. And in the Wadi Rayyan, this is what I did my PhD research on. I got a group of archaeological mates together and we went and we surveyed all the dolmens. Now, because they're empty, we can't look at what was buried inside them. We can't look at how the bones were treated or what people were buried with. All of that information had gone. But the advantage of a dolmen cemetery over an underground cemetery is that in order to understand the tombs in an underground cemetery, you've got to do a hell of a lot of excavation. You've got to move a lot of dirt, which takes a lot of time and a lot of money in order to get some information. But you can walk an entire dolmen cemetery in an afternoon. And so over the course of several weeks, we actually went through several of these dolmen cemeteries in the Wadi Rayyan, and we recorded everything. We did the length of the capstones, the height, the ratio, the position in the landscape, how they relate to each other, how they relate to the view, they relate to resources, all of this sort of stuff, so that we could sort of produce a really detailed analysis of how these different dolmens were built and what they looked like compared to each other. And we found exactly the same as what Meredith was finding from inside the subterranean tombs of Baba Dra, that they were all the same, that their chambers were the same lengths, that they were built in the same way, that they were constructed in similar ways, that their capstones and their ratios to their height and their width and all that were the same. There were no outliers. If they were being built for aristocrats, you would expect something bigger, something better, and they weren't there. They were all the same. And that, to me, is the biggest argument, that these aren't tombs for chieftains, that these are family tombs built for general families in the community. And the point of construction here is fascinating, because we assume that because people in the ancient world, don't have the industrial tools, that to do something like this was special. But actually, I don't think it was special at all. I think it was pretty easy to build this if you had enough people coming together, as you would do, say, to harvest your olive trees. Communities are really good at doing community events for particular purposes. And they may not even be going, right, somebody's died, we need to build them a dolmen. They might have been constructing these slabs of dolmens just as part of their annual cycle, so that these slabs were there ready to be built when they needed another tomb. And one of the things we discovered when we were going through these dolmen cemeteries was a half quarried slab, one that they'd started quarrying and then abandoned. And that was fascinating. So it's a limestone slab, perfectly flat on one side, perfectly flat on the other, and it's been undercut all the way through. And by excavating around it and looking at how they were quarrying it out of the bedrock, we were able to work out the steps of extraction and production and then construction from going from a piece of bedrock to a dolmen tomb. And I think by calculating weights and all of this sort of stuff, we reckon it would have only taken about maybe 20 people. And if they had a donkey, even less, and they did have donkeys then. And in terms of actually getting it out of the bedrock, that was probably one of the easier things, because the limestone is embedded with lines of flint, seams of very brittle flint, suwan, harjar suwan. And that, when we were digging underneath, we were finding thousands of broken shards of this. And I think they were heat fracturing it. I think they were quarrying the rock down to one of these beds of flint, probably building a fire on top, and then getting it really hot, throwing water on top so that it's changing from very hot to very cold very suddenly, and the flint kind of explodes, it fractures. And then they scoop that out and they've undercut a large part of the rock. Do that a few times and suddenly you've undercut a monumental slab. So it doesn't necessarily have to be too hard, it just has to be done.
What do you think about the so-called Jordanian Stonehenge? It's a project called the Ritual Landscape of Murayhat project, run by Suzanne Kerner. It's close to Madaba, close to Main. And indeed, in that area, there are around 100 dolmens. Is there a direct link between Wadi Rayyan and that site?
Yeah, so Susanna Kerner, University of Copenhagen, has been doing this project down at Murayhat on the Madaba Plains. And that is, I think, one of the most exciting projects and one of the most exciting sites to do with dolmens. It's been called the Stonehenge of Jordan, this area. And it is quite extraordinary because there's a kind of a central knoll upon which there are sort of weird megalithic slabs, and whether these are temples or cult centers or houses, we don't really know yet. But there's hills all around it, and then coming down through the hills are covered with dolmens, and they have a clear line of sight to whatever this central structure is. Because if you go around the edges of the hills, as soon as you stop seeing the central site, you get no dolmens. So clearly they're being built with a particular focus in mind, and it's a very well preserved, what has been a very well preserved cemetery, although now mining is threatening large parts of the area.
They have a quarry nearby.
Yeah, and that's a real problem, a real danger to the survival of this very important heritage. But what Susanna has been able to look at, and what other scholars have been able to find, is that, yeah, these are probably the same period, maybe early Bronze Age 1, so 3000, 2005, somewhere around that period. So in terms of what the dolmens I was looking at in the Wadi Rayyan, they're probably the same period, done by the same sorts of people at that time. In terms of a direct link, I don't think that, there's one person moving between them, trading or being a dolmen specialist, but it's part of the general cultural milieu of that late 4th millennium, early 3rd millennium thing. It's what people do in these sorts of areas at that time to bury their dead.
Do you think Wadi Rayyan was a kind of ritual site? Do we have evidence to claim that Wadi Rayyan was some kind of a shrine?
Was Wadi Rayyan a shrine or a ritual center? I don't think so. I think it was much more prosaic. I think, people are there for they're drawn up the Wadi because they're kind of pulled by the economic diversification that the Wadi offers. So particularly the olive, as well as, say, grape, and these crops, these horticultural crops that grow well at these higher altitudes with good drainage, such as olive. People are drawn to the region because they can see the economic potential for harvesting olive, producing olive oil, using olive oil, and trading olive oil. So it's a much more economically driven trend rather than a culturally sort of religious driven trend. But this is the ancient world. You can't divorce the economy and religious structures. They all tie up together. And that there was probably religious shrines up in the Wadi Rayyan because people were there, and that's what people did. I was excavating again at this site El Kawarij with Jamie Lovell a few years ago, and we found on top of the ancient olive stuff from the Chalcolithic Copper Age, a building dating to the start of the late Bronze Age. So we're talking maybe 1500, 1400 BC. And I think that's a temple. I've yet to prove this, but the reason is that it's got a particular kind of Baltic ware called chocolate on white ware, which means it's kind of got a very glossy white background with a browny red chocolate decoration on the outside. And you get this in temple structures such as Canaanite temples, particularly a type called a migdal or a fortress temple. And so there's a big one, the biggest one anywhere in the Levant has been excavated at Pella, just down in the Jordan Valley. And then there are smaller temples, and it was excavated, one at Tel Katan, Quaritch. What's fascinating about them is that they're all at crossing points. So the big one at Pella is kind of the center. That is the ritual center. That is your Canterbury Cathedral or your Mosque of Mecca or whatever. Yeah. These smaller ones in hinterlands around, they kind of tie in the center and how it uses the agricultural landscape. So there's, Hayat, you're at a major crossing point across the Jordan Valley River. Same thing for the one at Tel Katan, across the major crossing point on the river. And this one up in the Wadi Rayyan, it's one of the few points where you can cross. In fact, the Roman road crosses there to get up to Jerash from Pella. So these are points of the landscape where people are like tendrils coming out of a center. Maybe they're moving, trading, living, farming, but it kind of ties in urban city cults with religious practice in the hinterlands. It's a fascinating way of understanding how societies were not just city focused, but rural focused, and how they were enmeshed and entwined.
And for the end, what are your plans in coming months? I think COVID-19 also shattered some of your plans in 2020 and 2021. We haven't seen you for a while. The last time we met was in 2019. And unfortunately, the current pandemic affects not only ordinary people, but scholars. When do you plan to resume your project in Jordan?
Yeah, like everyone, it's been trying to juggle things around the indefinite times in which we live in with the pandemic. There are two main things I want to do for Kobuk Ozlan. I think we've pretty much answered our question at Kobuk Ozlan. Is this an ancient olive oil factory? Yes, I think we can say that now. There are two things that I still need to do though. And the first is that the last time I was there was November 2019, just before the world turned upside down and the apocalypse happened. And we did large scale excavations and got some really good information out. But one of the things we weren't able to do because we didn't have time was to do the flotation. And what that means is that when we're digging as archaeologists, when we get to a nice level, the floor level, the inside of a room, we take lots of soil, say maybe 20 litres of soil as samples. And we do this from this side at Gazelles, we do this a lot. So we've got bags and bags and bags and bags and bags, dozens, hundreds of bags of soil, which looks like we're about to start some sort of composting farm. But actually, that's got really valuable information within it in the microscopic level, because all the ancient organic bits, the bits of charcoal of things that people are burning, the bits of crushed olive that people are pressing, the bits of, say, wheat or barley that people are eating, all of that lies in the soil, but we have to get it out. So we've done a bit of this sort of flotation before. And what that means is we set up a kind of a large barrel with a series of small sieves, and then with a motorized pump, pour water through the barrel, and it shakes up the water. And then when you pour the soil in, into the water, it gets all mixed up like a washing machine, and all the mud and the rocks sink to the bottom, but all the organic materials, all that tiny microscopic bits of organic remains float to the top. And you can skim it off, and that gives you a brilliant window into looking at what people are doing, their sort of behaviors with the environment at the site. And when we've done this from our first season, it was extraordinary, because what we would expect from a farming village of this period would be, sure, a bit of olive. You'd expect a whole range of species: fig, pomegranate, barley, lentil, wheat, all the kind of standard domestic package. You'd expect a whole bunch of wild species that they're burning as well as charcoal, gathering up juniper wood or ziziphus. Nothing like that. Exclusively olive. The researcher in charge of this is a remarkable lady called Dr. Caroline Cartwright. Caroline is a senior research scientist here at the British Museum, and she uses a scanning electron microscope in SEM to look at these debris under huge magnification, and she can determine what species they are. And Caroline discovered two things. The first was that all the wood that people are burning is exclusively olive wood, and that it marries very well with this interpretation of it being an olive factory, because people, as they're maintaining their orchards, they're stockpiling wood, and that's what they're using as fuel. Why go and get other sorts of wood when you've got a ready stockpile of fuel ready to go? And the other thing is that from every single sample, Caroline was finding what's called in Arabic the jift, the crushed olive stone. So remember how I said the olive fruit gets crushed into paste? Yeah. Well, that makes really good fuel. So they're probably burning that as well, which is why it gets preserved into the archaeological record. But Caroline was able to identify tiny bits of broken olive stone all through the soil samples. And that's really important information, because it's our smoking gun that olive pressing was happening here. Problem is, we've only done a little amount of this. So we need to do a lot more to see if these patterns hold, and also to get some good organic samples for radiocarbon dating, because we need to do some radiocarbon dating. At the moment, we've dated the site somewhere between 2500, 2000 BC based on the styles of the ceramics, but we need to refine that by doing radiocarbon dating. So hopefully, if we can get back to Jordan soon, because I miss it so much, I'll be able to go to Jordan with Caroline and a couple of other archaeologists, and we can do all this flotation from the material that we collected in the last season. So Caroline can do her analysis, we can do some radiocarbon dating. And then I'd like to do one more excavation season. We started digging a building I spoke about these storage areas. There's one building just to one side of that doesn't look to be storage. And I think this is where people were living when they were up there. Nothing says that they were there for a long amount of time. There's no rubbish debris or superimposed floor surfaces and all this sort of stuff you get from a normal village. But of course, if they're there for a month every year, they're still got to live somewhere. And I think we've hit that kind of squatting house, the kind of, temporary camp where they are.
Like
so we need to finish clearing
seasonal
that.
Cottage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's an agricultural workers' cottage.
Because they're doing the same thing in our time. In the summertime, they go to Central Plateau, and in the wintertime, they go to Jordan Valley or near Hor or near Dead Sea. In the summertime, it's unbearable to live there. Now it's 50 degrees in Jordan Valley. So they normally climb up to the mountains to run away from the heat.
Yeah, I think that's what we're finding in the archaeology. You're absolutely spot on. And I think that's actually, when I sit back and go, well, what do I like about this project? One of the things that really makes me smile and makes me scratch my head is the fact that what we're looking at in the Bronze Age for the production of olive oil really is no different, as you say, to what's going on now. And the last time we were there, November 2019, that was during the olive harvest. And one of the reasons why we were digging then was to look at how people are harvesting their olives. So as we were digging an ancient olive factory, all around us, people were picking their olives and then taking it to an olive press. And about 2 kilometers away in the Wadi Rayyan, near a village called Kufrabil, there's a modern olive factory. And for 11 months of the year, its door is locked, its lights are off, its machinery is under plastic. And then in middle of October, when the olive season starts, someone unlocks the door, someone turns the light on, someone uncovers the machinery, and it becomes one of the most vibrant, dynamic places in Jordan. And I think that factory in Khirbet Ghazlan, which is functioning today, is exactly the same as to how the ancient factory at Khirbet Ghazlan was happening 5,000, 4,000 years ago. And I think that's remarkable because it shows you the resilience and the importance of olive oil in people's lives over the last 4,000 years in Jordan, and the fact that it is so integral to how Jordan works. And that some things are timeless. And one of those things is the production of olive oil. And I love that.
Do you want to add something else, or we can stop here?
No, that's good, unless you want me to say anything in particular.
I'm only going to say that I'm very happy that we managed to meet up after 2 years. Hopefully we're going to meet in person when you come.
Too long.
When you come to Oman, and I'm looking forward to hosting you at one of my places. Hopefully
that would be lovely. Well,
you're more than welcome.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your lectures back in 2017 and 2019, and your contribution to the archaeological research in the Levant, because we're not going to talk only about Jordan. Jordan is only one place in the whole Levant, is very significant. I'm very happy that you found time, and thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, and inshallah we'll see each other in Jordan very soon.
See each other very soon. All the best.
Great. Thanks. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully see you soon. Bye.
Bye.